Okay, folks, today I want to talk about the long-term effect of North Korea partnering with Russia in order to perpetuate their mutual agendas. And we're going to review Peter Zion video where he talked about this just a couple of days ago. Last week I talked about this video, Bros, where it was essentially the Russian view of what they put on their state media of the Kim Putin summit. And it was really interesting how that played out. It didn't, I mean, they didn't talk about any particular gains. Now, we all know that Putin wants weapons and Kim wants weapons as well. But I don't think that it's necessarily weapons. Now, in this video here, I talked about Putin's becoming desperate, and here's the proof. And he was actually, there are Cubans sent to Russia to do cleanup work, and then they're sent to the front lines. And that's the essence of that video. And I think, I don't know, but I think that what he wants is not just weapons, but men. And okay, with that as a preface, let's look at what Peter Zion had to say here, because I think that's the direction that Putin wants and needs to go. Okay, here's Zion, and I'll stop and interrupt him periodically.
Hey everybody, Peter Zion here, coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona. Today we have to talk about the summit between the strongmen of Russia and Korea. So Vladimir Putin on the Russian side and Kim Jong-un on the Korean side. They met in one of the Russian cosmodromes in the Far East, and the primary topic was whether or not the North Koreans can provide the Russians with military assistance, which, for anyone who has a sense of history, the irony here is practically bleeding out of the sky. Anyway, the issue, of course, is that the Russian war in Ukraine is not going to spec. And when you have a conscript heavy...
No, it's going to the glorious plan. Everything's on plan. Or so says the propagandists. They say, everything's wonderful. We're doing great. And so, well, is it?
Force like the Russians do, you try to use standoff weapons that aren't particularly smart in large volumes, specifically artillery. If you exclude either China or the United States from the math, Russia has more artillery than the rest of the planet combined. And best guess is by the end of this year, they'll have gone through over 20 million artillery shells. Artillery shells.
That's a lot of artillery shells, and that is the way that they fight. And so they don't try to man up and, match you 1-to-1. They try to blow you into oblivion and then move forward, and then blow you into oblivion and then move forward. But what happens if they run low on that? Then they have to go to meat wave strategies, and that hasn't worked out well. So they're really desperate for more artillery shells, and they're starting to produce more, but it's going to take a while to ramp up that production.
Don't age particularly well, and after they're more than like 10, and especially after 20 years old, the explosives start to crystallize a little bit, and that can make things decidedly lively when you try to, move them, especially when you try to launch them. So the Russians have had a lot of accidents with the transport system, their logistical system, and then, of course, they've had a lot of barrels on the artillery just blow up from the inside. All of these are bad things if you're trying to launch a lot of artillery. So they need more shells, and they're turning to North Korea, which I believe has the world's 4th largest stock of artillery. The problem here, of course, is that North Korea's industrial plant isn't exactly great either, and a lot of the North Korean stuff is actually older than the Russian stuff. Gives you an idea of how desperate the Russians are for ammo.
Okay, so, and that's part of what I mean by desperation. I don't think Putin is desperate in the sense of, I'm going to give up, or desperate in the sense of he's going to do something really crazy like nukes, but he is turning to places that you never thought that he would have to turn to in order to provide for his war.
Now, the question, of course, is what do the North Koreans get in return? Because the Russians don't have anything from a trade point of view that's of use. You might be able to send a few tankers of crude oil, but the Russians honestly need that for hard currency earnings. So the question is if there's anything else that can be transferred. In terms of military technology, there really isn't. One of the things that the Indians have found out recently, that they've been developing missiles and planes with the Russians where the Indians provide a lot of the capital, and then the Russians provide the technical know-how. And what they've discovered is very few of those contracts are actually being honored by the Russian side because the Russians have lost the technical capacity to manufacture even moderate numbers of planes. So they're now starting to back out of all their contracts because they realize that the Russians have been lying to them the whole time.
Well, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? And as you keep doing that, you will start to tick off your partners. Now, one of the things that they do have is know-how, and they do have technology, and they have the ability to, they have the intellectual capital to be able to do it, even if they don't have the technical components. So, but then the problem there is that they don't have the technical components in North Korea either, because they're even more embargoed historically than the Russians.
In addition, there's some talk of like maybe a nuclear-powered vessel or submarine, but it's taken the Russians 15 years to build their last nuclear-powered ship, which was an icebreaker. So the argument to be made here is whether or not the Russians even have the capacity to sustain their existing nuclear naval fleet, much less build new ships for themselves, much less have surplus to transfer to North Koreans.
Yeah, I had a troll the other day tell me, well, the Russians can build out 15 ships in a year if they wanted or something like that. Well, how are they going to get them into the Black Sea? It's controlled by Turkey. Well, they're going to bring them through a canal. There's a canal system from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and there is, lo and behold, a canal system that works that way. But at a certain point, your ship has to be small enough to get through that canal. So I just don't see those kind of things, but trolls seem to love to say the nuttiest things.
Honestly, it's looking pretty poor for that. That doesn't mean the Russians have nothing, and it doesn't mean that it's not a problem. It's just probably not going to be the things that most people are talking about. Look at where the meeting was, the Cosmodrome. This is a facility out in the Far East that the Russians built when they lost control of the Kazakhstan Cosmodrome at the end of the Cold War. And when it comes to launching satellites or intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Russians are still one of the few places in the world where that technology can theoretically be obtained, even if the Russians have lost the capacity to build a lot of new stuff themselves. So
that's correct, and Kim wants that desperately. So desperately he can taste it, because he rightly perceives that if he just has enough nuclear tech, he can threaten people to get what he wants, because he operates kind of like a mafia state. Like that's his mentality, just like it's Putin's mentality. And so these two mafia dons are getting together and discussing how to do business. Peter also just talked about how they met at this Cosmodrome. Well, they met at a location that was very close to the border of North Korea.
The primary global concern, primary regional concern for North Korea is missiles, long-range missiles, and that is something the Russians have in spades. So whether it's officially part of a program to launch a satellite into space, which, whatever, or more likely to deliver a payload to another hemisphere, that is something the Russians can and probably are willing to transfer to the North Koreans, because the Russians are no longer party to any meaningful arms control treaties
Nor do they have any compunction about giving the North Koreans this kind of thing, because after all, the North Koreans are probably going to use it to saber rattle against folks like the United States and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a win for the Russians if the North Koreans get that. But what are they getting in return? It's not just artillery, I don't think. And he's talking about artillery so far. And I think that there's more to the story. I think Putin needs the manpower as well. Now, there's been some significant talk about another wave of a mobilization after the elections. Well, the elections just took place. Well, at least these elections just took place. I don't know if they're talking about after the elections, meaning after Putin's reelected, or which he certainly will be, barring some unforeseen thing. I mean, he's going to rig the election for himself. But I think they were talking about after these most recent elections, this midterm kind of elections. And so I can't see that he's going to do it, but maybe it's going to, like, there's a lot more people talking about it than not talking about it when they talk about mobilization or the numbers or that kind of thing. So we'll see. I just don't see it yet.
All, which will generate no end of headache, not just for the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese, who, newsflash, the North Koreans hate the Chinese, but also the United States. There's not a lot the United States can do about this, because the North Koreans are not in a position where sanctions work at all. All you can do is punish the Russians indirectly and hope for the best. And that's not a great security strategy, but that is where we are. Yeah, that's all I got. Bye.
Okay, so that was his take on the interaction between. But even then, there was no solid, firm commitment. And that's what I was explaining in this video here. When we got to the end of it, like they talked about the menus, that they talked about the car that Kim ogled while he was there. Later articles would talk about how Kim got to see a a nuclear infused jet plane, or one that can, shoot nuclear weapons, and he was in awe of that or whatever. But there was no firm commitment through any of this conference. So the conference was pretty much a wash. It was, as I said in another video, it was a pretty bad week for Russia. Like, it was not a good week for the Russians. Okay, at any rate, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. I hope that helps give you some understanding of like where Russia is and what they're after, which is primarily artillery, but I think also manpower, and what the Russians could potentially give the North Koreans that could just make it harder for the entire world. And that's where we are. Okay. Thank you for your time, attention, the coffees, the subscribes. If you subscribe, please ring that bell so you're informed. I do these videos daily. And thank you more than anything else for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.